I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present our data using phylogenetics to track the spread of HIV in the province over the last 2 decades. The HIV epidemic in Quebec was established in the early 1980s among men having sex with men. It is a concentrated subtype B epidemic that has persisted over the last 20 years. The HIV epidemic among intravenous drug users was also established in the early 1980s, but unlike the rest of Canada, it was largely controlled through the early introduction of needle exchange programs, and the epidemic is largely historic, with less than 2% of the epidemic since 2002. We do have a heterosexual subtype B epidemic introduced through migration through key sectors, including the Haitian community and recent migrants from Central and South America. We also have a NonB subtype epidemic originating through migration and globalization from heterosexual epidemics in Francophone countries where HIV is endemic, and as well a lesser MSM population that is introduced into the province. Phylogenetics allows us to use viral subtype and clustering to evaluate trends in HIV spread over time. We can assess the impact of migration and globalization on the introduction of new strains, and we can evaluate the benefit of treatment as prevention in averting HIV spread. So if we look at the subtype B infections only, we can see that the epidemic shows 3 patterns of viral spread. Singleton transmission, where one individual gets infected and it becomes dead end. Small clusters, where individuals can have networks of 2 to 5 persons. And this small cluster networks of singletons and small clusters constitute 50% of the epidemic and 95% of strains. Unfortunately, we have large cluster outbreaks in which 5% of strains lead to super spreader events and through the genesis of large cluster outbreaks that persist over 2 to 10 years, depending on the viral strain. If we look at the epidemic among men having sex with men, over 60% of the epidemic can be attributed to large cluster outbreaks. The heterosexual epidemic among people who inject drugs in the upper slide shown in green is largely historic by the basis of the years of spread. And we have diffuse NonB subtypes being introduced into the province. So if we look and follow the spread of HIV among men having sex with men through tracking subtype B infections in small and large class networks, what we can see is the dramatic reduction of 70% of new infections from 2008 to 2019. This is due to the introduction of single pill regimens, improved drugs such as integrase inhibitors, and the implementation of 90-90 treatment as prevention strategies. Despite the dramatic reductions in small cluster networks, we see that HIV persists among men having sex with men through large cluster networks, and this has offset the benefit of treatment as prevention strategies. We also have the ongoing introduction of heterosexual epidemics of subtype B as well as non-B subtypes, and this has led to the ongoing introduction of new infections, and 50% of the epidemic arose in 2017, and new epidemics emerging through migration has exceeded the epidemic among MSM since 2017. So we need to understand what is triggering these large cluster outbreaks among MSM, men having sex with men, that is leading to the persistence of HIV among men having sex with men. And what we can see is large cluster outbreaks are largely sporadic. They emerge and they persist over varying period of time in which 4 to 22 new infections can arise within a single cluster, and this epidemic can persist as a microepidemic over time. And if we look at the 50 large cluster outbreaks that have sustained the HIV epidemic, rising from 13% of all infections in 2002 to over 65% of the epidemic, we see that large cluster outbreaks can persist over defined period of time. As you see with the blue clusters, you can see an epidemic that originated in Montreal can spread to Quebec City. If we look at red nodes, we can see the Quebec City epidemic, microepidemic of cluster 67 is persisting in the 2017 to 19 period of time, whereas the Montreal epidemic has ended. So following clusters can help us understand where the epidemic is growing and when. If we look at the HIV epidemic over time, we see that the epidemic of large cluster outbreaks is due to transmission cascades of early stage infections. Viral diversity can be a marker of the proportionate amount of large clusters that can be attributed to new infections versus late stage infections. And what we can see is large clusters are largely due to cascades of early transmissions that are not diagnosed in a timely fashion and not treated early enough. The decline of singleton and small cluster transmissions has been due to a reduction in late stage infections. We have to be able to control early stage infections. In addition, we can see that large clusters are reflected of large cluster networks that are rising in increasingly younger people with under the age of 30, and that is biphasic. And you see that these small cluster and large cluster networks in younger populations that must be addressed. If we look at the NonB subtype epidemics, we see that these are largely diffuse epidemics originating through migration, and the amount of acquisition of of NonB subtypes has not arisen in the province, apart from sporadic large clusters that are spreading not within migrant populations, but within MSM populations. So we must assure that the acquisition of large clusters does not impact in the introduction of distinct strains, particularly CRFO2, AG recombinants, and G, that are coming from Europe, where half the epidemic in France can be attributed to these viral subtypes. So phylogenetics remain important to follow the introduction through migration and to assure that subtype B and non-B subtypes do not lead to heterosexual epidemics. And here you see subtype D and F in the pink represent the potential transmission among recent migrant population. So if we want to conclude, we can see that we have been able to control the epidemic among MSM through averting transmission of small cluster networks, the majority of strains, but we need to address large cluster outbreaks and the factors fueling these large cluster outbreaks. In addition, we have to assure that we have appropriate treatment as prevention strategies for new migrant populations, which are highly highly vulnerable populations, and we must be assured that they have adequate access to treatment as prevention. Altogether, I would like to thank Michel Roger and Isabelle Hardy and our group who has studied HIV over the last 20 years. Thank you very much.